Pond loaches are strange fish, and they find themselves in an even more strange situation in South Korea. But before we get to that, what makes the pond loach so unusual? They can breathe through their skin. They can survive out of water for days. They're the most farmed fish on Earth, yet very few people know they exist. And most of all, they might just be the most unlucky fish in the world. But to understand why, and to really understand the fish situation in South Korea, we have to start with the basics. Pond loaches don't just breathe through their gills, but also through their skin. This ability evolved because they live in environments that experience droughts and fluctuating oxygen levels. Now, for most fishes, a drought would be impossible to live through, but not for the pond loach.
Okay, I just was walking by. This is all dried up for days and days now.
Loach.
Look at that.
What type of fish is it?
The pond loach.
How long does it take for them to die?
I don't know.
But most other freshwater fish would not put up with that kind of environment for long. They would die from suffocation. So they're pretty good out of water for a decent amount of time. That's not to say that they enjoy it. That's to say that they can cope with it, right? It's still, a stressful situation for them.
Now, this capacity to survive in very challenging conditions, even outside of water, sounds like a huge advantage. But as you'll come to learn, this is a double-edged sword. One more thing you should know is just how common they are. Now, I live in the UK, and when I'm at a party and I inevitably bring up the pond loach as an icebreaker, people look at me blankly. It seems that nobody around me has even heard of this fish. Sure, there are a very small number of people who keep them as pets, but apart from that, they are completely unheard of. And that's strange, because pond loaches are the most farmed fish in the world. They're used in South Korea's famous dish called chueotang, and estimates suggest that around 22.6 billion of them are being slaughtered for food every year. If we assume that each pond loach is around 6 inches long on average, and we were to put them in a line, well, that line of these small fish would take us around the Earth 85 times. But to understand why the pond loach is the most unlucky fish in the world, we have to take a look at how exactly they're being killed. Because not just any fish could be killed in this way. In most cases, when you take a fish out of water, they suffocate and die. But as we know, the pond loach can survive extended periods of time without sufficient water, and so they get transported alive in these buckets for days until they reach the restaurant.
The sorts of conditions where they're extremely crowded with poor water quality and those sorts of things are definitely not a situation that anyone would like to see any animal transported in. So there's undoubtedly a case to be made there that they would be suffering from extreme stress if they're in really bad conditions and being transported for long periods of time.
There, someone pours them into a bowl and salts them while they're still alive. They are then mixed with other ingredients before being put into boiling water.
Honestly, I've never seen anything like that. It's not a method that I've ever seen used on any other animal, least of all on a live animal. Most fishes, including these loaches, would have an aversion to changes in salinity, but to apply salt directly to the skin is unbelievably cruel. I mean, by salting these fishes while they're still alive, you're effectively sucking the water out of their bodies, which is just going to cause massive stress, physiological stress. And undoubtedly the fishes will be well and truly aware. They're not only being salted, but they're being handled, right? So there's no water. They'll be aware of that. So they won't be able to breathe properly. They're being salted. You could hardly think of a crueler thing to do to an animal.
There are some variations in how the loaches are killed. In fact, there's one I'll tell you about that is even more peculiar than this, but this does seem to be how the vast majority are killed. And that begs an obvious question. Why? Why are they being salted like this? But before we get into that, I do want to be crystal clear that this isn't a video blaming South Korea specifically. I mean, here in the West, we do very similar stuff, whether it's boiling lobsters alive or putting pigs in gas chambers where they can't breathe. I mean, sadly, humans do bad things to animals all over the world. But there is more to this situation. There are these Buddhist monks in South Korea who are doing something called mercy release, which is a practice where animals are freed from captivity in order to create good karma. And because pond loaches are so small, and because they're so cheap, they're often selected for this practice. Tons of pond loaches are bought and then set free into the water, which in and of itself is of course a noble thing to do. And I'm happy, obviously, that they care about animals so much. But in this specific situation, it seems like another double-edged sword. The problem is that this has led to a new market, where vendors are supplying loaches specifically for sale to the Buddhists. And so, while likely coming from a place of compassion, this practice is probably just exacerbating the problem by causing more pond loaches to be bred into existence in order to be saved. But look, I don't mean to be too critical of Buddhist monks. They of course do lots of great things, like adopting stray dogs and cats. I imagine a lot of them just don't know the long-term consequences of buying the loaches. But it's sad, because there are things you could actually do to help address the pond loach situation. And as bad as I've made all of this sound, we're still not seeing the full extent of the issue, because we're not accounting for all the fish that don't make it to slaughter. Look, I don't know exactly what pond loach farms are like, but I do know that this fish is unbelievably tough when it comes to surviving in challenging environments. And around 27% of loaches die in the farms before reaching slaughter weight. Given the slaughter method, maybe they're the lucky ones. But as I said, while salting is the most common practice, it's not the only method. The strangest one I found was to put the loaches in a pot with a block of tofu and add water. When you boil the water, the loaches will try to escape the heat by burrowing into the cold block of tofu. The irony of this is that the method itself relies on the fish feeling heat and wanting to avoid it. I mean, the very technique that kills these animals reinforces the fact that they are conscious. And while I would prefer it if no fish were to be slaughtered at all, I think almost everyone would agree that there has to be a less terrible way than this. Which brings us to why they're using salting as a slaughter method. You know, one day I would like to go to South Korea and investigate this more thoroughly, because at this point, it's not entirely clear to me. But I do have some theories, and I imagine it'll be a combination of several factors. Number one, it's practical and efficient. A method that involved handling each individual fish would be more difficult and time-consuming. Number two, salt is something that the recipe requires anyway, and the suffering of the fish just isn't a consideration, so why not? Number three, it's always been this way. This is how previous generations made the dish, and so it continues. Throughout my research, I found myself repeatedly going back to these videos from a small number of people in Asia who keep them as pets. It even looks like some of the loaches are engaging in play with people they've learned to trust. When you see so many animals crammed together like this, it's easy to lose track of something important, because each one is an individual, each one having their own experience, each one destined to go through something beyond words. But maybe they don't have to be. Today, people care more about animals than ever before, but this progress is far too slow and doesn't reach fishes. Not in South Korea, not in the West, not anywhere else in the world. The pond loach is a strange fish, and they find themselves in an even more strange situation. There are billions of them, yet they've been invisible to us, and they may just be the most unlucky fish in the world.